Welcome to day 5 of the Learning Ideas Conference, our 14th annual conference. And first, under this name, I'm David Koralnik, and it's great to be here with you once again for our final day of the conference, which I'm excited about. So really looking forward to today. And we've got a few things to cover before we get to our opening keynote, which I am excited about today. As we go, again, please feel free to continue tweeting about the conference using the hashtag LearningIdeasConf. So we're always happy to see people on social media and really enjoying the conversations going on the various platforms. LinkedIn, of course, as well. Conference team will still be on Twitter and on LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and anywhere else that you might want to find our conference team. Sessions are running in Zoom, as you've seen, accessible from the Hoover platform. And as you have questions or comments as we go, then please post them in the Zoom Q&A. So lots going on our last day. We've got a full program coming up, starting with our opening keynote and then concluding with the announcement of the winners of the IELA Awards, the International E-Learning Awards Business Division. So that'll be at the closing session at 5 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time. So lots going on. But before we move on to talk to Mike, I want to talk a little bit about learning experiences. And Mike's going to talk about AI and things we can do and things we need to be aware of in the world of artificial intelligence. I want to talk a little bit first about how AI might specifically help in the world of education and what an experience might look like. So here's a potential future learning experience. So here's a student in the future standing in his room, and you might wonder what he's staring at. He's not sitting at his desk. Doesn't even seem to have anything on his desk. He's just staring. And the reason is this. So, he clicks a button somewhere and all of a sudden projected on his wall is ancient Greece. So he's studying ancient Greece, and this is how he's doing it, through being able to immerse himself in this world. So if you zoom in a little bit and see what he's looking at, and he says, is that the Acropolis? And he can do this by speaking. He could do this by typing. So who's he talking to? Which is a reasonable question. He's talking to his AI coach. So he has a coach here who says, there are actually a number of buildings known as an Acropolis in ancient Greece. She explains what the word Acropolis means. And the Acropolis in Athens, the one that he recognized, is a famous one. And so that's helpful. So we have an AI coach who's always around to help him out. And the conversation can continue. Did the Acropolis always look the same? He might wonder. He has a coach to help him. Since we don't know much about the architectural appearance of the Acropolis before the Archaic era, which started in the 8th century BC. But here's one major addition, which was built by Pisistratos, and that's an interesting historical point to make. And take a look, so she can show that to him. So she can move that in so he can see it. And he might ask, who was Pisistratos? And she can tell him. The ruler of ancient Athens during most of the time from 561 BC to 527 BC, son of Hippocrates, which is interesting. So there's a lot of interesting, this is a pretty good way to learn history, right? This is better than reading a book. And he could theoretically do even more. He could, be more self-directed and decide where he wants to go and where he wants to see and get a very realistic experience of traversing through ancient Greece and learning about it. He might want to learn about Socrates by having a dialogue, one might say, with Socrates. And that's the kind of thing that theoretically we can do. Can't do all of these things at the moment, but this is, an imaginary future that, at least parts of it are not necessarily so far away. So he continues, the Acropolis is so much bigger than I imagined. All right. So, he's a student, he's got comments to make. Not all comments are questions about specific things related to, content in the educational sense. It's a very human experience that he's having. We can also leave the virtual world that he's in and visit Greece today and still have the AI coach with him. So he could be there with the AI coach through, again, maybe through his phone, maybe through some kind of goggles, some kind of modern version of Google Glass. David Kelly talked yesterday a little bit about what that might be. There's one example of sort of a futuristic, AR goggles. So there are things that, definitely things along those lines that can happen. All right, so that's just a fragment of what an experience might be like in the not so near future, or not so distant future, rather. What are some key elements of it? It is experiential learning in a very realistic context. right? You really learned by doing, by experimenting, by experiencing. Coaching guidance, so we have the AI coach, and there are certainly challenges in the AI coach being that realistic and being able to correctly parse and understand and reply to all of the things that the student may ask. And that's one of the challenges that continues. It's an area I did some work in back in the early 90s. And it's slow. Basically, it's been a continued slow area. There was feedback and coaching guidance from a coach and from peers, though. So we have this realistic coach guiding you. We had feedback from the coach and potentially from the peers. So we didn't really see much of that part, but we had the possibility that when he was in modern Greece, he could also be talking with other people. They could all be, collaboratively working in the same system with the coach or not with the coach. They could all be, some could be watching in the virtual sense, some could be watching, live where he is. They could all be discussing this. There's a lot of learner control. So he was asking questions, but he was assisted and advised. So he wasn't just, randomly somewhere. And, an ideal coaching component would know and learn a lot about him. So might know things like, here's what this particular person is interested in. Here are some things that I might suggest that he'd really want to explore. Here are some questions that I have for him to challenge him a little bit that are right for him based on what I know of his knowledge. So it's about knowledge, it's about interest. If we build the right kinds of systems over time, there's a tremendous amount that we can do using AI techniques. And a lot of the focus in our field has been on AI, kind of, the analytic sense of this part, trying to intelligently understand what people have accomplished and what their strengths and weaknesses are. And that's certainly a big step. But to take that and feed it more directly back into the experience is, I think, sort of my own dream vision for what this, what we can do, among other things. So it's a very immersive, personalized experience, and we could add a lot more learning by doing than we saw in this brief example where he was kind of just asking questions and wasn't fully dictating where he might be able to go. So, this is just one of many AI-driven concepts. There's a lot we can do, and also a lot of questions surrounding AI and its role in education and its role in society. Will AI change the world? Will it take over the world? Will AI experts take over the world? There are a number of questions, and those lead me to our next keynote, who I'm delighted to have with us. Michael Kanaan is the Director of Operations at the Department of the Air Force and also at MIT in artificial intelligence. So he really has credentials that are unmatched. He is the author of a very popular book called T-AI, which you can go out and get your copy at any of your favorite online or in-person booksellers. He's the former chairperson of artificial intelligence for the US Air Force, headquarters at the Pentagon. He was named to the 2019 Forbes 30 Under 30 list and Fast Company Impact Council, and these are just selected accomplishments. There are even more. The US government's Arthur S. Fleming Award, which has been shared by Neil Armstrong, Robert Gates, and Elizabeth Dole, so he's in good company already. And we're really looking forward to hearing what Mike has to say, and he's going to talk to us about artificial intelligence reaching the end of the rainbow. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Mike. So we're going to go ahead and start Mike's video, and Mike, going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, David, for those kind words. And just as we get going, just confirm that everyone can see the slides now and we're all good to go, right?
We are good. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. So good morning to some, good afternoon, and good evening to the rest across the world. I just want to begin with expressing my appreciation to all of you here today and throughout this conference. You've covered so much, from an incredible list of speakers and keynote and breakout sessions from people who I deeply admire. And I'll do my best to bring justice and round out and crystallize some of those technology topics at hand with our collective why in artificial intelligence. So with that said, very personally and humbly, thank you for the opportunity to share and for your genuine care and interest on the topic. It's a topic that will underpin the conversations for a generation. AI, machine learning in particular, is providing us new methods, new strategies, and new solutions to limitless aspects of our personal lives, our careers, business interests, and our cultural and international relations. Those new methods, strategies, and solutions haven't been available to us when left to our own biological device, our own intelligence. And that's because our own human form of intelligence has natural limitations when it comes to observing and collecting data analyzing it, and then developing the cumulative information, insights, and knowledge that can emerge from it. Don't get me wrong, our brains can do wondrous things. I don't believe an AI-driven computer ever will. But likewise, it can do things, well, that we never will. Yet despite all the promises AI provides, to most of us, it's as mysterious as ever. All of the different sciences, the math, the engineering, the interrelated social disciplines, the legal and ethical aspects, and certainly the coding algorithms and computer technologies. All of those things make most people conclude that AI is just too complex, too sophisticated, too obscure, frankly, to teach or understand. And that's an unfortunate misconception, because all of us can and should understand an AI. In fact, we all must understand AI, at least well enough to understand and hopefully even engage in the conversations now becoming critically relevant to success in the not so future world. Those conversations aren't dominated any longer by hypothetical science fiction or alarmist fears of some super intelligence that will take over the world all on its own. No, the conversations now focus on the real immediate impact of AI, including both the benefits and the detrimental aspects. So what is it? Why is AI so significant? And why is it any different than our own human capabilities? For that matter, is it any different? The answer is yeah, it is. And as humans, we have certain intellectual strengths that I don't believe will ever be replicated by AI, at least not along the arc that the current technology is currently ascending. But as humans, we also have certain intellectual weaknesses that AI does not. Likewise, it has strengths that we do not. And those strengths characterize the potential of AI, and they paint the context in which we must understand it. This is why it's not going anywhere. It's only growing. What I'd like to do today is bring the science of AI down to earth in a way that's a bit different. I want to discuss AI from a human-centric perspective without the usual technical math and science-based jargon. With that said, this is an AI for people explanation. So to understand the essential nature of what AI does and how it's capable beyond human limitations, let's look to an analogy by talking about what it is that we see when looking at a certain purely natural phenomenon, rainbows. Let's think about the way rainbows become visible to us and about the colors and patterns we always see. Then using that understanding as a reference, we'll conclude by addressing how AI can see things, specifically patterns of information, differently and more deeply than us. First, let's make sure we understand what rainbows actually are, how they're created, and what we're actually seeing when looking at them. No doubt we all know what a rainbow looks like. We probably all drew colored dozens of them when we were young. Imagine in your mind then with me, your most immediate vision of a rainbow. Okay, with each of us having colored a rainbow in our mind, I bet all of our pictures are very similar. With some slight deviations, I'm quite sure that each of you conjured up an image pretty similar to this. The locations, backgrounds, or other scenery you imagine are probably different than mine. But when it comes to the actual rainbow itself, I've no doubt you imagine something, well, unwaveringly similar. A multicolor sunlit arc, probably high in an open area sky, descending to two distinct ends opposite of one another. Generally speaking, that's a rainbow. But hold on, what is a rainbow? Is there some physical thing that's actually suspended in the sky? And if any two of us were standing next to one another, looking at the quote, same rainbow, would we each be seeing the same thing? The answer is no and no. First, in order to see a rainbow, we need two components. We need a sufficient number of water molecules or raindrops suspended in the air. And at the same time, we need direct sunlight. Oh, and from our point of observation, the location of our eyes. That direct light needs to be shining at the water droplets from an opposite direction behind us. So if we see a rainbow to the west, then the sun must be to the east, and rainbows to the east, and the sun must be to the west. The point is this: the suspended water droplets, the sun, and our eyes must all literally be in the right place at the right time. Now let's talk about those two components, sunlight and water droplets, a bit more. First, light. The sun emits a wide array of light in various wavelengths that make up the electromagnetic spectrum. Radio waves, microwaves, infrared, ultraviolet, X-ray, gamma, they're all forms of light, but their wavelengths are outside the limited range that we humans can see. The light our eyes are able to detect falls within a very narrow range of wavelengths, which we call the visible spectrum. And as you can see, it's a very thin slice of the overall spectrum. So in all of the darkness that is out there, there's actually a lot of light, a lot of information, but we can only see a little bit of it. The combination of all visible wavelengths of light is called white light, which is generally what we see. It's the light that brightens our day and illuminates everything around us. But when it passes through a prism, the 7 colors that make up the visible spectrum break apart very clearly into their different wavelengths. Again, the sun light we see is a mixture of all colors in their spectrum. But when it passes through a glass of a prism, that mixture breaks apart as the different visible colors of light are bent or refracted to a degree different depending on their wavelengths. As a result, the light leaving the prism spreads out in a continuous band of separated colors. There are 7 of those colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And when those colors bend as they pass through a prism, red, having the longest wavelength, is bent the least all the way through orange, yellow, green, and blue, and indigo, which has the shortest wavelength and is therefore bent the most. The order or pattern of those colors leaving the prism will always be the same. By the way, as we look around ourselves and see the colors of objects that fill our world, what we're actually seeing are the different colors and combinations of colors reflected from the surfaces of those objects. Those colors they seem to be, therefore, are nothing more than the reflection of wavelengths of light that aren't absorbed by the object, and they're reflected back and stand out indistinct from the combinations of all colors. Now, in a rainbow, the individual droplets of water separate the wavelengths just as this prism does. And when sunlight enters a droplet of water, the beam refracts at different angles as it passes into denser water and then reflects off the far side of the water molecule before exiting back out near the front of the droplet itself. That direction is 42 degrees lower than the original incoming beam, always 42 degrees lower. Now, though, the light is broken into the separate color bands of the visible spectrum, and that's a rainbow. And just like light coming out of a glass prism, the light coming out of a water molecule will always follow the same pattern. Red will be the outer and upper band. Violet will always be the inner band. The last 2 of the color bands, indigo and violet, are pretty weak. So depending on the intensity of light, they're sometimes tough to see and might even appear absent, but nonetheless, they're always there. And all of the colors are always in the same order. In the vision of the world we're capable of seeing, that pattern will always be present. Our human eyes couldn't possibly detect anything different. Now, there are 2 things I find interesting about rainbows that people rarely think of. First, 2 people sharing seemingly identical experiences of a rainbow are actually seeing 2 entirely different things, even if standing only a few feet or inches apart. The pattern they see will be the same. It can't be different. But the rainbow is dependent upon the unique emissions and angles of reflected light entering our eyes. It has no physical existence. So the truth is, we might agree with the person next to us that the rainbow is there, but the rainbow one person sees is definitionally different from the rainbow the other person sees. Secondly, if our human eyes and brains worked any different than they do, the rainbows we would see would look totally different. Other animals and creatures that see and detect different wavelengths than us must experience rainbows entirely different than we do. And some of them can even see some of those wavelengths of light that to us are simply invisible. So what does any of this have to do with AI? Well, it's really quite simple. By analogy, think of all humankind has learned about the world around us and how best to manage our way through it, including our relations with one another, as the rainbow of our cumulative sight. Think of AI as a prism, and think of the data that's created by all we do, all we record, and all that we've learned is the white light that can be directed into that prism. The machine learning algorithms that enable AI systems you've talked about this week or heard about in passing, and all the emerging technology and ideas for learning essentially break those streams of data into characteristics and patterns that distinguish them. Through code and algorithms roughly represented by this illustration you see here, those systems sift and sort through data by weighing, measuring, and evaluating at the speed of light and with a capacity that far exceeds our own human memory and processing capabilities. That gives these systems the ability to discern patterns and characteristics within data beyond what we're able to see, and can reveal new knowledge, new methods, strategies, and solutions that are simply outside our scope of our sight. Without AI, like much of the electromagnetic spectrum, they would remain invisible to us, or at least not accessible in real or useful timeframes. Think of machine learning as a process that can show us new colors, new patterns, angles, and rainbows in most everything that we do. Now, will some people out there on a different ideological side of the spectrum than us seek to use one or more of those new angles to their advantage and our disadvantage? Yes. And that's why it's so critical that we're aware of AI's advantages, teach it, learn it, and that we all, as citizens of the world's democracies, strive to ensure that AI is only used in ways that are transparent and that paint the brightest and most colorful arc for us all. In a lecture entitled The Hidden Beauty of Rainbows, MIT astrophysicist Walter Lewin concluded that those who understand how white light is fragmented into distinguishable, separate bands of light in a rainbow will, when looking at one again, objectively see much more than those who don't. Knowledge, he said, always adds. Knowledge never distracts. Knowledge is hidden beauty. Your life will never be the same. I believe the same can be said of AI. It will reveal knowledge previously hidden from our sight. That's its very purpose, and our lives will never be the same. Gratefully, I've been afforded many opportunities in the field of AI, from chairing it for the Air Force to working here at MIT, where that lecture and so many discoveries have taken place, that perhaps simply by osmosis, I've been able to pick up what matters. Is it the tech? Is it the algorithms? Is it writing in Python? Is it building a computer? Is it math? Yeah, sure, it's all those aspects, but it's not what matters. What matters, especially at this critical juncture, is education. How well we understand the rudiments and real potential of AI, anticipate its social and geopolitical implications, and coordinate the course ahead are imperative matters. Conversation and learning is crucial, but for the dialogue to be meaningful, we must have a common understanding of AI, a common appreciation of its potential, and a common recognition that, like all powerful tools, it will be put to use in ways that affect our lives. There are tough questions in the future that lies ahead. Who would have thought that once upon a time, becoming an accountant wouldn't be a viable, healthy middle-class career in the future, until in one fell swoop, seemingly overnight, TurboTax was released as a software service to us all. Travel agents? No, thank you. I use Google Flights. Expert customer service? I'll search for that answer on the internet or watch a YouTube video. Banker making a loan decision? Nah, algorithms. And here we are in the pandemic, and being closer with many of these Fortune 500 companies through natural business dealings I can assure they learned digital works. I can assure you they've learned automation, and in their fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, software and machines are cheaper than people, and they believe that they can still get business done. Frankly, they've learned that. There are difficult questions and rocky roads ahead. Things will change. But do not abandon all hope, ye who enter here. I thought some, Dante's Inferno would be an appropriate quote after that last slide. Who would have imagined that video game designer would be one of the most lucrative career fields in the world, the industry as a whole? Web engineer, you mean Spider-Man? Graphic designer, content strategist, chief listening officer, drone pilot, genetic counselor, internet marketer, app builder, social media manager, AI ethicist? No way. What are those jobs? For some of those jobs, you might have said that only 10 years ago. So what's going on here? We won't lose all jobs. What's different about these new jobs? Well, the conclusion is that many jobs in this world were tasks or have become so over time, and more will. And information work, those things that are routine information, will not stay. The world is much less about what you know, but what you do with what you know. And that's okay, because it's all about how we respond and the demand for creative thinkers who have an understanding of topics, but can see and build solutions that yet don't exist will succeed. Work will go on. It's just the character of it will be a bit different. In fact, with the rise of automation and AI, provided we understand and we teach and expect people to generally understand as well how it works, which I'll get to in a moment, the future is actually bright. You see, while we're always concerned, AI is nothing different. It's the very essence of technology. Because technology, regardless of the type, from AI to the steam engine, technology is about doing more with less. That's it. So the future can be bright, full of amazing discoveries, time and space to think about them, and frankly, be more human. Because a lot of our lives nowadays aren't very human. And with every solution from all this newfangled tech, will just come new problems. There will always be an infinite number of problems that we need to creatively solve. So we have to arm the people so they're not preparing for jobs or learning in a way that was for the past world. But it can only be done if we understand it. And for far too long, despite even those in the proverbial know, we can't help but go back to those science fiction imaginations, wondering when this computer in front of me will somehow emanate consciousness, or when those evil government doers will imprison us with robots and drones, all while failing to see the opportunities just at hand. Dreams of existential risk at the expense of what's here today and providing what's necessary to capture the world to come. Because as optimistic as I am for the potential we collectively have to make the future ours with those new jobs and solutions I mentioned, really make it the next generations, I'm concerned it's not happening enough, not soon enough. And worst of all, why isn't happening enough? It's not Terminator and stuff. It's pretty simple. It's that picture in the bottom left-hand corner of mathematical variables. This belief that AI is just for those math people, those people who speak computer, the quants, not the artists, and only the select few who have an engineering mindset. And let me be clear, that thought is a disservice. It's a travesty, because I promise the future rock stars in tech will be teachers, sociologists, dancers, artists, psychologists, parents, and many more. And this mindset matters, not only for the next generation, but tomorrow for us here now. In fact, I was recently in a hackathon for the city of Detroit to bridge the digital divide, in which 40% of residents do not have internet access. And think about that. How could that be? And furthermore, that's not just one-off city in America, whether rural or urban, or more so around the world. That's reality. And that's a problem if those words about it's not just for math people are going to become true for us. In addition to that, I'm often in conversations with executives and businesses in public service where people often lament that we just don't have the talent. I'm sure you've heard that before. We just don't have the talent we need. And I tend to look at them and say, how can you say that? How can you openly complain of those around you or the bleak future of the economy when you offer zero upskilling? Or for example, 1% of your profits aren't put back into lifetime learning. The point is, when it comes to this tech stuff, there's a lot of bad faith, disingenuous arguments made about a future we can actually control. So up front, the tech community can't keep looking like me and my tech and science background. The proverbial boardroom that looks like every other boardroom, can't look the same. But we're in a vicious cycle in this field of AI and keeping the same old going. And unless some part of the ecosystem changes and forces the change around it, there will be a day where we might refer to this generation an inflection point as the great nap if we don't try to change it. Each of us should have our own journey towards understanding AI. And if there wasn't a single advancement today on, it will still profoundly impact human opportunity and experience for decades to come. So what's the delta? What's the rallying cry? Well, it's here. This year, the US will graduate 50,000 people with STEM-like degrees for 500,000 open jobs. But we live in a world where we can lower the barriers to entry to education, provided there's resolve. We shouldn't care if you have a college degree or not. Have you done it? Can you do it? Do you have a passion to learn it? How do we as nations help drive down the gap is what matters, because in only a short years, there will be 1 million open jobs in this emerging tech space. And look, it's not like we're going to suddenly make all people mathematicians, engineers, and coders. But we can fill this gap if we reimagine what the job space is and who can fill it. And we do that by bringing AI into the fold, into curriculum, and thinking about it a little bit differently. So let's get cooking. If you were to ask me what AI is, I'm sure this conversation has come up before in your life. It often does. I'd ask back, do you mean it's in a business practice? Because in that case, I'd say, think of AI as a mirror, a flashlight, or a canary in the coal mine. What it does is illuminate otherwise ignored or undiscovered latent patterns memorialized in the world around us, which helps us strategize by asking new and better questions. Then you might say, no, we're not quite there yet. I just mean generally, like, what is AI? I'd say, okay, well, academically, the commonly accepted definition is the ability of machines to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. Except you might think about that for 20 minutes and end up realizing, well, that's an awful definition because it's a rolling definition. With that one, it would mean that an abacus was AI, TI-83 calculators were AI, Excel files were AI, and now Google search, I guess, is AI. And I'd say, yeah, you're right. It's why we constantly kick the can down the road on what AI is and say things and hold beliefs such as, well, that's not real artificial intelligence. So I agree, let's make the definition a little bit simpler. AI is just software designed to analyze data and formulate predictions without any overall guidance from us. That's it, fair enough. But then you might say, wait, I thought you mentioned that we can all contribute to the field and you're just talking about computers now. In fact, you said it's crucial for society we all contribute. And yeah, that computer talk doesn't help. And nor does thinking about AI as a thing. It's more of a journey. And it's like being in the kitchen and anyone can contribute there. You see those ingredients? Think about that stuff as data. You see those appliances we use? Those are algorithms. They just optimize for something or do particular things to data. And then we have models or sturdy software applications with lots of those algorithms and stuff. That's like a recipe. And at the end of it all, the meals we make, the dishes, those are the predictions. AI is a lot of steps, many considerations along the way. And with this mindset and this definition, you don't have to necessarily be an engineer, do you? More to the point, have you ever walked into your grandmother's kitchen and while she was making a dish that you love, or into the kitchen of a Michelin star restaurant and stop them and say, wait, Grandma, are you sure you can make that food? Because you're using that oven, that stove top, that microwave, that crock pot, and plugging things into electrical outlets. I need to stop and ask so I can trust your food. Do you know Ohm's law for electricity? Or can you build an oven? Oh, and with those new ovens, code them as well? Did you grow those tomatoes? Your grandmother might laugh. She might get mad. The Michelin restaurant definitely will, and say, get out. I know well enough not to stick a fork in an electrical outlet or cook tinfoil in the microwave. I've practiced making food, and I also know when to take it out of the oven and when ingredients don't work together. Now, go away. Voila. That is an allegory for artificial intelligence. That's where we need to get to. Because it's not about the tech, it's about using the tech. Teaming people who can build things with others, it's about the context. And that, as this future is further democratized, those with the context and an understanding will benefit greatly. It is but a tool, but those without understanding, it'll be to their detriment. They won't even know what to do in the kitchen, and they might not even be allowed. And that's dangerous. That's what we're hoping to inspire here today. What is the context of AI all about? Well, for me personally, in writing T-AI, I wanted to ask myself that question, to go back in time and wonder, what would have I wanted to read to gain the context? Because too many of the resources and ideas were either fully technical or start talking about the major concerns in the world with glossing over what AI is and how the heck we got here. If you want to understand artificial intelligence, you can't start the conversation at what is AI. You have to know a bit about our own biological evolution, concepts of numbers, both big and small, how they work, the history of why we made computers, because it depicts a lot of things how we do it now. Language and our brains are crucial topics to basically understand. In fact, for what it's worth, arguably the most successful AI CEO and visionary is not a computer scientist in a classical sense. He's a neuroscientist. Then after all of that, let's talk about what AI is and use words like neural network and talk about massive computing because it will make sense now. Then with those two legs of the tripod, we as society and our students can talk about the all important conversation of business and where things stand at the international stage. That's how AI starts to make sense, and we can all do it. It's also the reason I designed T-AI the way I did, to do so in a meaningful sense. Because we're saying anyone can learn AI. And I know that whole statement, anyone can learn about this and contribute, seems a little trite, colloquial lip service, but we can, provided it's showcased and shared in ways that are meaningful in various disciplines and presented in individually unique ways, which is not as hard as you might think. Not everyone is good at math. Not everyone is good at art or history, but it's not because they don't know how to learn. Humans learn incredibly from the moment you come out of the womb, but it's only for the most when they step into the classroom that eventually the conversation even comes up about not learning well. And yes, that's the tension we all know and feel as educators because, well, we have many students and not everything can be individualized. So we need to find ways to present AI in more unique scenarios, and then even ourselves leverage AI to find what works, like we saw from David earlier, which we've heard about those technologies, and that's why they're worth exploring. The question then should be like, okay, how do you talk about AI in different ways without coding or being computer science? It's a fair question. Well, what about when students learn about the Cuban Missile Crisis? There's a follow-on conversation about automated weapons and what's right, what's wrong, and how they work. What about as they read Brave New World, 1984, or Asimov, we discuss modern day dystopian concerns with AI happening across the world and computer vision used to track people in autocratic nations. How about in biology? And as we teach about viruses, we then discuss how we make vaccines with machine learning and through simulation. And I could go on and on. The point is that this AI thing is akin to electricity. That's how it'll be in society in the not too distant future. And what's most important is that we're generally aware and we're exposed to it, and that we can see the world through the lens of AI. In fact, if you do see the world through the lens of AI, you can see solutions all around you. You can see the rainbow. You're so empowered. And in closing, before any questions, I leave you with this call to inspire, I hope. Our focus now must be to address the current realities so we can ensure to the best of our abilities that AI is only implemented in ways consistent with our own fundamental beliefs and only for purposes consistent with democratic dignities, liberties, and laws. And as you think about that quote, I thought a lot about that quote, and I rather enjoyed it, and I felt that it was encompassing, but we were missing a couple aspects. So we added to it. To convince the public in particular that using AI to achieve these aims is a necessary and desirable part of our society, but we can't afford to do so unless we know how it'll be best used and when. But in the end, the future demands we make moral decisions as we begin to build a world that is truly safe and sustainable, one where humans and AI can truly coexist together. And here, I felt that it was completely encompassing, that it covered the call to action that we should have within each of us and that we should inspire in others. But here's the plot twist. I wrote the first paragraph. This paragraph that you're reading right now, that's artificial intelligence. It's a natural language processing algorithm that I use based off of my words to finish it itself. And I don't think I could have wrote it better. And that is the world that we currently live in. That is what getting AI looks like. That's where mis and disinformation comes from. That's how we read news. And that's what's here to stay. And with that, I'm looking forward to any questions and all conversation. And again, truly grateful for the opportunity to share.
Fantastic, Mike. Thanks so much for your talk, and we're looking forward to continuing the conversation. We do have some time to have discussions and questions. There's a question in the chat, which actually is about your book. If there's a link that we could find it on Amazon, but do you have a link that you want to share for the book in the chat?
Oh, sure. I mean, I'll tell you what, Amazon is awesome, but at the same time, and it's very easy and it's all great. But if you can support a local bookstore, if you're at bookshop.org, that's also wonderful for communities. And you can buy it anywhere you'd like, but it's largely available.
Great. The book is T-AI and can be found, it can be found at any major bookstore, any major online bookstore.
Audible, if you're an audiobook fan, whatever it is.
Great. All right, great. Well, we've got time for questions and discussion. So lots of things that we want to talk about. One thing I want to kind of start with while we're waiting for other questions. So, well, maybe we're not waiting so long. So I will go ahead and go to the first question. So here's a question from Christina, which you can see in the Q&A if you want as well. Says, you're using a very romantic metaphor of the rainbow to explain the potential of AI. Her question is mankind, meaning educators, leaders, team members, politicians, everybody else, are they ready for AI? So how can we make sure, or I guess optimize the chances that we turn in the right direction at this important juncture? So what can we do to help people, I guess, make the right decisions is the way I'm interpreting that in this world of AI?
Well, I think this is a very insightful point. And, taking this glass half full approach, I tend to be in the camp of being quite bullish about the opportunities at hand and not always so bullish on the way that we execute them. First, from the national level, I want to highlight that there is an increasing awareness of the problems that are at hand and that the solutions need some practicalities and it needs an influx of policy that just certainly doesn't exist. The $50 billion that is being dedicated to the semiconductor industry, I think signals to the world and is good news. At the same time, there's an increase in standing up the National Artificial Intelligence Office, which will come with, of course, recommendations from the National Science Foundation and the rest to provide money to our educators and signal demand for teaching about these things. I think there is a fundamental problem with the way that we think about AI as educators. And I hope I made it clear throughout the presentation that it's just for math people, that we need more STEM groups, that we need more computers in front of us. And I just think that's a woeful misstep on how we think about it. Of course, we want to provide opportunity, and the digital divide is real, and it is very unfortunate, and we need to influx cash flow into public education and the rest to signal demand for that. But at the same time, we need to teach artificial intelligence in the context of how the learner learns, right? And what they're interested in. I'm very fortunate to sit on the board of advisors for a nonprofit called the AI Education Project, which we've taken a wholly different approach, which is about teaching AI within the humanities. Of course, STEM matters, but presenting it in much more unique ways. And in business competitions that we've launched throughout, I shouldn't say business, pitch competitions for students throughout the country, I'm always heartened to see the answers that they provide just when they're provided an opportunity to see AI, like they just have no idea about it. And some of them are like, using computer vision to look at plants that are important to somebody who, and she wanted to become a national park ranger. And I thought that was brilliant, right? For how moose move and everything else, that nobody was thinking about it in that sense, because why in the traditional sense would somebody think about technology and national park services, right? Those things seem to not go hand in hand. And I think, are we prepared? No. And that's what the call to action is that we can learn about it though in our own ways.
Right. Following on that, and Christina, very much appreciate your talk and also your reply, she says in the chat. Following on that a little bit, you mentioned the nonprofit and you talked about, I guess, AI, education about AI, I think in the schools briefly. Are there also initiatives to reach adult population? Because it feels like that's probably also what we, the student population is great, but that's going to help us maybe a little bit more down the road.
Yeah.
But right now, there's a lot of misunderstanding in the current adult population. So have you worked with the nonprofit or elsewhere to think about how to reach, reach today's adults and help them
This
understand what's out there and that they don't need to be afraid or what they do need to be worried about. All of those.
This is really interesting. It's gonna, this shouldn't be a offense, right? But this is truth. Really good K through 12 content on artificial intelligence really works well for adult workers. So you can use both at the same time. And are there many fields, like some altruistic entity paying attention to adult workers? And we're not just talking about reskill, go learn to do Python, right? Like just general awareness. Is there some altruistic organization? No, there probably should be. Are companies realizing it? Some, probably not as many as there probably should be. I think that's for anyone out there, that's like a really nice niche that I'm quite certain that major enterprises might like to have education. This is something that we do here in the Department of Defense. In fact, we've created education that, and mind you, we're all adult workers, right? So we created 3 hours of core curriculum that we will launch to 650,000 people, which is its own tech challenge to make that work, right? On government systems by the end of fall. And then with that 3 hours of dedicated content that you must go do these things, it comes with 30 plus hours of optional content. And I think that if you're not in the business of education, if your enterprise or your business or your company isn't providing chances to go to conferences like this or other things to reskill and learn, you couldn't be more behind, and you're probably going to lose. That's the worst competition ever. At moments of inflection, education matters. And I do want to highlight one time we did this in society, because I think it's really important. And back in 1958, Sputnik launched over the United States. Now, at that time in America was just sitting around, right? It was literally the night of one of the games of the World Series. In addition to that, what we were teaching in America is back-to-back World War champs. A job was homemaker, right? We had gotten rid of all science and engineering. There was no money going into it. Life was just very cushy for some. And then in a moment, Sputnik launches over the United States, and they see that one night. Now, they weren't afraid of the fact that there's a satellite in space, which, that's crazy, right? That's never occurred. But more so because of the intercontinental ballistic missile technology that took it there. So if it could be over America, then it could enter back over America. And America was shaken. Now, they created NASA after this and all sorts of other stuff. But one point that's not talked about is the National Defense Education Act of 1958. In a ridiculously bipartisan move, which was unseen for the times, seems apropos today, they released over $800 million of 1958 money into the United States for education. In fact, most of the university network, I'm literally like looking out the window at MIT right now, exists because of that, right? How much was 800 million then dollars today? And it created this entire system, and we know how it went. 10 years later, America goes to the moon. I think that's kind of we stand at the precipice of one of those moments again. And I hope that that's what we can ultimately inspire.
Great, we have lots more questions and they're filling up. So I have a couple follow-ons I'm going to save for later. Next question from Maddie is, some people say, guns do not kill, people kill. Is there a possibility that we have the same kind of challenge with AI? We want to use it for good, but there's the dark side that attracts some practitioners of AI. So that's Maddie's question in the Q&A. So I want to hear your thoughts on that when you can.
This is a profound question. So there are two things. Number one, the narrow and specific purposes to which we ourselves put our machines will be where the problems reside and the solutions arise from. That is just 100% the case with the current state of the technology. In addition to that, you're talking about something that's really crucial, and it's the inherent duality behind artificial intelligence. So I'll use an example very briefly. We're all concerned about deepfake technology and its ability to create mis and disinformation and how performant it's getting lately, especially lately. Here's the problem though. Deepfake technology the underlying technique, right? These are all mathematical techniques, and just thinking through problems is a technique called reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is very, very important for us to advance, and it advances the science. The same science that makes deep fakes better is the same science, and we use deepfake technology as the leading detector of breast cancer. That is why we science. That's awesome. The problem is that in previous advances, think about all the technologies that profoundly changed the world, nuke energy, et cetera. Research and development was in the hands of only a few to the benefit of the many. But now in research and development, it is immediately available to the public, and it is all about the lens through which you use the artificial intelligence. So as we advance the science and do good with it, the problem is that it is very simple just to do bad with it.
Yeah, that's absolutely a concern. Are there more things we can do to head that off and to stay ahead? Are there things that, that are possible to do without, I guess, going to a structure where things are not out in the public, which is just not going to happen at this point?
Mm-hmm. I think that you can't fit square pegs into round holes. It's time to carve out some new square holes. And I think that's what we're seeing in society, is we have to rethink the entire character of things has changed. And we have to get down to brass tacks and reimagine, we see the world today. What is cybersecurity in 2021? What does that even look like? The notion of how everything was built because of the rise of this technology, again, much like electricity, has to be probably rethought for the most part.
From your work in the government, to the degree you talk about, do you feel that there's maybe an opportunity to take some of the educational stuff that you've been talking about and distill it down even a little bit more, and get it in front of Congress, get it in front of the right people in government? Because I've certainly seen my share of congressional hearings on TV. When anything gets a little bit technical, you feel like the questions are not as informed as they might be a lot of the time. And I would imagine with AI, it's even more so with a lot of people. So are there things that you can do at a governmental level, at least within the US at this point, to help people better understand? They're not going to put in 30 hours to see 30 hours of optional content. I could put in 3 hours probably to see 3 hours that you have. But can you, can the nonprofit help maybe distill down to, 30 minutes of like, look, this is what you really need to know, and, help people understand what they should be watching out for, and, from a societal standpoint, what AI really is and can be, and what to be aware of?
Yeah, I think so that's going on. And as easy as it is to let our worst inclinations lead us to believe that's not going on, I'll tell you what, if there's one group of policy decisions that have just been moved forward from when the Obama administration began its moves in artificial intelligence, to the Trump administration moving it forward, to the Biden administration now executing it, it is literally the same policy that has been slowly growing with the same ideas and picking up steam and momentum. I don't think I can name any other policy that just stretches across the board. Now, for what it's worth, there are some things that we need to do in the policy world. I'm very proud of, most recently, the National Defense Authorization Act. I know everyone gets hung up on how much money it is, but it's an omnibus spend package that has a lot of stuff in it, right? That kind of pushed through because it's law, and it happens very quickly. We pushed through, and I'm very proud of writing it, is a section called the Computer Language Initiative, in which the Department of Defense will treat aptitude and proficiency in human foreign languages as the commensurate equivalent to those in computer languages. And I think that is a huge deal. Now, it doesn't replace it or anything, but we are signaling demand. It comes with education, and we keep pushing that forward. And it provides those who come to the military and DoD the opportunity to upskill for a life skill that can literally change your life for the rest of time if you learn that. So it's little things like that that are going on. I do believe that from the highest policy levels is what's most crucial in order to kind of embolden the system as we speak right now. Sometimes the top-down hammer approach has to be the thing that's done. More cowbell.
Okay. Somehow I'm imagining, water cooler conversations, people standing around talking in Python, but that's probably not quite where this is going. Or maybe, I don't know. Next question. Kinga has a question. Kinga, you met on the on her wonderful podcast she's been doing for us all week, and on her own before and after. Really great to listen to Kinga's podcast. She has a great question here, which is, ethics in AI is widely recognized, but often ignored by those in power, government and corporations. There are great people advocating for ethics to be taken seriously, but what can the general public do to ensure that this happens?
So, great question. I'm going to push back on the first part, that governments and corporations are not working on ethical artificial intelligence. I have more conversations on the ethics of AI than any single other conversation. And I'm talking about with foreign governments and with corporations and internal to our government than any other conversation. In fact, most recently, within the past week, even the Department of Defense released its responsible AI principles out to the entirety of the public. All corporations and many have stood up different boards. I'll highlight Google's board, I'll highlight Microsoft's board right now, and there's numerous conversations going on. Now, with that being said, some governments and others, we can treat it more seriously, and there's a lot that still needs to be accomplished, most certainly. And here's a little bit of the rub, and this is where things get interesting. If you know the path of artificial intelligence, and it's very simple, it's based on data, and the more data you see, a computer doesn't know what data it doesn't see. And what artificial intelligence essentially does is predict the things that happened before. Right? That's all that it's really doing, and optimizing for whatever solutions and seeing things you might not have seen. So with that being said, this whole notion that, I'll use a company example, I'm an Android user versus an Apple user. I'm a green text, you're a blue text. What that really means is we're looking at different data, right? Because data is our gold. It is what is most important. It's what makes us different. But what does that mean also? That if we were going to have the most representative AI that shares with everyone, that views everyone, right? Then, well, everyone should be the same text. We should share data. But businesses can't do that. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholder. Nations, though, in the most esoteric stance of it, fiduciary responsibility, their shareholder are all citizens. And that's why it's so crucial that artificial intelligence and ethical use of artificial intelligence be led by governments. And I think we're seeing that grow throughout the European Union, certainly. And then, of course, with many of the very, very public things the United States is doing. And I can name 10 countries off the top of my head. Now, how do we make sure as citizens we care about that? It starts with being a little bit more informed, and I'll give you an example. We can't trade capabilities unwittingly for things that compromise or might conflict with our ideals of respect, human dignity, freedom, and values. And what do I mean? Well, there are companies and capabilities and technologies that we use that there is the fear, and a very real fear, that that data is used to better artificial intelligence in some other country because you're using that AI, that because you enjoyed putting the bunny face emoji on your face, you're using computer vision algorithm that makes that algorithm better for someone else out there in the world to use it to track minority groups or people who disagree with them. American society, when we choose to use certain platforms or give up data and the rest, we have to be informed and say, well, what is going to happen with it? Most people don't realize when you're not paying for it, you are the product, not the customer, right? And I think it starts with realizing that will help out society make better choices. Our values have to match our actions.
And I guess one question relating to that, your thoughts on data security. I know when I've shown the little sort of futuristic demo that I gave at the beginning of before your talk this morning about the sort of AI experience, that's an ideal world that requires a system that knows a lot about me as a student, right? If it were me, so about any student, knows your strengths, it knows your weaknesses, it knows your preferences, your likes, your dislikes. You're really trying to build this coaching component that really knows you, and which is just a great educational experience. It's having this person who really understands you and can help direct you in the right ways and know when to challenge you and know when to not challenge you and know what you're interested in and know what you might be interested in. Those are really nuanced things. Mm-hmm. But then there's data about you that's somewhere that has all those really nuanced things. And you don't necessarily want a potential employer or a random hacker on the internet or anybody else to find out all those things about you. So what are your thoughts on sort of the advantages of AI and the sort of security side of maintaining, making sure that data is kept secure enough so that we take advantage of it, but don't risk that it gets in the wrong hands?
This is a tough question. I can understand someone, I do, who says, I don't like having an Alexa in my home, right? Because it's collecting at all times. I totally get it, right? That privacy aspect. Now, I don't mind having Alexa in my home because the way that I view it is that I'm making that algorithm a little bit better. I'm informing it with myself and I'm going to be represented in data. I think that's a worthy trade-off because those who are not represented are those who will be disenfranchised. And that really comes down to, the topic of the digital divide. If Alexa's never seen you or what you do, then how could it serve you? And we have to have a real hard conversation on what right and wrong looks like in that space one day, as the proliferation is only going to continue. So the conversation about privacy, security, and often misconstrued thing, anonymity, I think is a really crucial kind of tripod or trilateral conversation that needs a little more sophistication than just simple yeses or nos. And we have to be very thoughtful about it. To what ends are our machines doing something?
Yeah, no, I think the key point you brought up is the idea of a trade-off too. I know people now who don't want to be found on Google. Like that feels too invasive, right? To just be out there, and we'll go to great lengths to not, have publicly accessible profiles in anything. But most people at this point, if you had a conversation with people in, mid 1980s and said, can you imagine a world where people could go on the internet and find out lots of things about you and see your talks and see the things that you wrote and, see who your friends are and all these kinds of things, that probably would have sounded invasive and insane to most of us in those days. And so there's sort of a gradual nature in which things do change and become more acceptable and accepted. And, I have to try to find the right lines where it is. But this does seem, even to me, at least right now, as if there could be so much data out there about you that it could reach maybe a different point. So a lot to think about. We have another question from Joan from Spain. Let's get back to the rainbow metaphor. So following on the rainbow metaphor, the rainbow might not be really there. It's just the question. The rainbow might not be really there, but it is there according to our perception. So this affects our way of experiencing the world. And he said, it somehow worries me that due to language and model limitations, the world that AI can process doesn't actually match our significant world or perceived or subjective world. So is there a risk that we might somehow lose access to that part of the world due to this? I think meaning to, I guess sort of our perceptions, I think if we rely on AI. So you want to take a look at the question, but I think my interpretation is sort of, do we risk losing a lot of subjectivity if we're kind of relying on viewing the world through the AI lens rather than through our own personal lens, which is a really interesting question.
It's 10 a.m. here in Boston, but that's a worthy have a drink conversation.
It is later than that in Spain. So
it is later than that in Spain,
4
right?
p.m.
It's 5
in Spain,
o'clock
I think somewhere. It's already time for happy hour on a Friday.
So I'm very appreciative of such a philosophical question that I'll try to handle without getting too philosophical and say it in practice. Artificial intelligence. So whether you're using it for your students or whether it's in real life, to the previous question, it doesn't know what it hasn't seen. So how do we deal with this in business practice? And I'll give a kind of an allegory or analogous problem that I think you'll see for the real world. We all in professional business, when you write up an answer to your boss or something, or for myself, answering some congressional task or inquiry, where you go back into the system and you answer the thing just in the precise way that was needed to be answered, but dang right well, the shortcuts you used, the the hacks you use to get that answer. And in all likelihood, that answer is not reflective of actual how business is being run or the business processes. So you send that answer back up and people look at it and then they say, oh, now we have all this data. Let's make AI off of it, right? So you make a model and then you send it out into the real world, into the business world, into practice, and nobody uses it. And the reason nobody uses it is because it wasn't reflective of what was really going on. Yeah, the question or the data you measured exists, but it's not reflective of everyday life. So what do you do about that? Well, in that case, the best business practice to make really good AI is to make sure that you're creating very structured, representative training data, which is this, it's not just you throw a bunch of Excel files for artificial intelligence and it works, but this training data that is happening in the daily process of the business, the things that you're actually doing. And then you take that and then you make models and deploy them out because it's representative of the world in which they live. I think to this question's point, I think that's a really sound one-to-one analogy for the data that we measure in our personal lives. Is the person you are on social media really who you are? Or is the person, is the thing that matters that companies and ads sell to people, is that truly who you are? Well, then in that case, we're going to lose out on something as AI continues to eat the world, right? So I think that's a really nuanced point to say, does the thing it's trying to solve for, is it representative of what I do? And I think that's a crucial question we should ask in our personal lives, at home, and in business.
Oh, that's a great point, a great question. I agree as well. It leads me to something else, sort of following on that, as you start to talk about the models and the data that feed the models and kind of, where that comes from. There've been a lot of concerns recently that algorithms, and AI algorithms can easily take biases that exist in the world today, and particularly in the US today, and further them, right? Without necessarily intending to, but if you're building something based on data that's reflective of where we are today, and there are biases that we have, systemic biases in our system, certainly, racial and otherwise, those then can get sort of almost not quite baked into they're not really baked into the algorithms, but they're the seed data, right? So in other words, The algorithms are going to learn from data that is reflective of a world that we are in, but not the world that we want, and not a world that we're even okay with in those ways. So what can we do from, as in the AI world, what can we do to try to avoid that, try to leverage the right things that we have to work with, but not leverage the wrong things and not perpetuate things that are very wrong and we've been trying to correct?
When we're in our businesses or in our classrooms or anything, when we're talking about artificial intelligence as a group, or you're in the executive offices, whatever it is, as a group, you need to first frame up, are we talking about artificial intelligence as a mirror, a flashlight, or a canary in the coal mine? 3 different categories for whatever we're doing. If we're trying to predict outcomes and we're quite certain of our business, we know what we need to do, right? I'm running it on budget sheets that are largely not going to be effective or affect anyone, right? They're filling in, likely budgets type of stuff and, missing, expense reports, whatever. All gravy. It's being used as a mirror and it's perpetuating the patterns that it learned. Now, on the flip side, are we using artificial intelligence in order to tell us about other people or tell us about ourselves and use it as a flashlight? So we want to take current state business ops and pick it up and say, what's going on here? And maybe we find out that it's good and we want more, make it a mirror. But maybe we find out it's bad and it becomes a canary in the coal mine. This is why I'm always hesitant that people, when they hear stories of bias abuses of artificial intelligence, or when AI finds biases, the question is, the statement should be not stop AI. It should say, well, what did you do after? Did you put it into operations, or did you, learn from it? Now I'll use the best case, the case of Amazon. So Amazon, all the news comes out that They hire more people who look like you and me, David. Of course, that is the way that the world has been lately, and it needs to change because it's reflective of their business. Now, here's the point that I think was lost, is that Amazon stopped using that algorithm and they realized they needed to change. In that case, that AI served as a canary in the coal mine, and they would have never known, albeit subconsciously, that they were moving forward with these bad business practices. I think that is a phenomenal use case of artificial intelligence, that it really shines a light on ourselves. And then as business owners, as educators, as people, is that smart to use operationally to predict, or do we need to change business? That's what's awesome about artificial intelligence. It's a totally different look than the one we're so fearful of.
It's a great example. Let me ask a follow-up question on that, though, which is, so you mentioned, this is a case where AI found the bias and recognized the bias. How do we make sure that that really happens, right? That it's able to recognize that that's a bias, right? People can't always recognize their own biases that they have, and it takes a lot of effort and self-awareness and to even try to overcome them. So how do we make sure that algorithms are able to recognize and at least elevate that may be a bias, rather than simply saying, well, this is the data I have, and accepting it at face value?
An ability for AI to know its own bias. There are people working on that, but that doesn't necessarily exist. But here's how you get past it. The way that you get past is when we think about a model's application, any model in the world, you can break into an X and Y axis. Essentially along the Y axis, imagine data. That is the machine's worldview, which is akin to experience for us. It's the only ways that we learn, right? Is we experience things. On the X axis, label that scope or reach, right? Is it a very narrow reach, like a telephone switch operator? Or is it much like an Alexa that has very broad scope and a lot of general purposes, relatively speaking, right? In that case, you can start lining up and say, I do not want an Alexa in my home that was only trained on Southern white gentlemen, or alternatively, only people from Northern California. Its scope is too big. The reach is too large. That would be not representative or fair for its use. So I think that in practice, as we try to deal with biases, which, by the way, biases aren't a bad thing, right? Bias stops me from, it defines I, don't like certain foods, or stops me from walking in front of a car, right? I mean, that they exist for good reason. Are those biases good, and do we want to perpetuate them? But I really think that as you get into the prospect of doing machine learning, is its worldview representative of its scope, is a way that until the day comes, we can, be objectively look at bias in a machine, which I don't think is happening anytime soon, or may ever happen, that we start there at least.
All right, well, a lot to think about, a lot of next steps, still a lot of work still to come, and so many ways, we're, as you mentioned from the beginning, we're at a critical point in time, and an absolutely interesting point in time, and there's so much we want to do from a societal standpoint and on all levels of this. Any last questions? It seems like we've covered so much ground in the time that we've had together, so it gives us a good chance to wrap up. Mike, I want to thank you again for spending the time with us this morning. Really tremendously enjoyed your talk and the conversation, and as did everybody. You can see from the level of participation. So Mike, thanks again for your time with us, and hopefully we'll be able to be around a little bit the rest of the day. For the rest of the conference, we are going to hit a break for a little bit and then come back at 10:30 with parallel sessions once again. Then this afternoon, we'll have the panel, more parallel sessions, and the International E-Learning Awards announcements at the closing. So once again, Mike, thanks so much. And we're going to wrap up this session.
Thank you, David. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks. You too. Take care.